Hello, everybody. Thersites the historian here. I'm joined tonight by Dr. Shepard, and we will be looking at the life and times of one Eugene Victor Debs, a labor activist, five-time presidential candidate, a person who was involved in the Pullman strike, and someone who was also involved in protesting World War One, among other things. So I guess we can start with his early life.
Absolutely.
I guess he's born in Terre Haute, Indiana in 1855.
That's right.
And Terre Haute is near Chicago, from what I
It
understand.
is. It is. It's not very far from Chicago. In fact, that part of Indiana, along with parts of Gary, is pretty much looped in the
Hmm.
Chicago geographical area. So yeah, pretty much. Indeed.
Yeah, because I guess most of his labor activism would have been, Chicago oriented, since that's the biggest hub nearby. In terms of his background, his upbringing, it seems like his family was actually relatively well-to-do when he was a kid, compared to most people.
Absolutely. And I'm going to tell you, from my experience, talking to people who would put themselves in the category of what Eugene Debs advocated for, most come from an upper middle class family. And I don't know if that is because they objectively see the privileges of what monetary stability can provide and what it can't provide. But yeah, most people who I associate with, talk to regularly, they usually come from a satisfactory, financial area, and they can understand why Eugene Debs um, was needed. You know.
Yeah, I mean, he's somebody who certainly grew up on the right side of the tracks, but understood what it was like on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Absolutely.
that being said, despite growing up I guess his family were immigrants from France.
That's right.
And his name Eugene Victor he was named after two different writers. So one of them I was not familiar with, Eugene somebody, and
Yeah.
then there's Victor Hugo,
Of course.
who's much better known.
Mm-hmm.
But so his family was, not only relatively well off, but educated as well. However, he took a different path in life
Absolutely.
because
Absolutely.
he will drop out of high school at the age of 14 and then go into the workforce from there.
Goes into the workforce, and that is when he begins to understand the term exploitation.
Yeah, and it will be a fairly slow evolution, actually, from his joining the workforce to his sort of emergence as this labor leader.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, I think that is what makes Eugene Debs and his theory, because of course we all know the saying, you can kill the man, but you can't kill the message.
Yeah.
So I think that is what's threatening about Eugene Debs and his idea of socialism, is that he had the experience, he had the articulation, great speaker, great orator, and people were able to identify with him because he had been in that position.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he started off, I guess, as just a guy cleaning things with the railroad when he was
Absolutely.
a teenager, and then eventually a post came open for him to become a locomotive fireman. So somebody didn't show up because they had been drinking or whatever, so they just asked him to do it, and so that was one of the more skilled positions. Not quite on the level of an engineer, but one of the more skilled positions. And so for a few years, that's what he did. He would, I guess, fuel the engine of
Yeah.
the car. And so this got him involved in organized labor for the first time because he joined the union that was specifically for locomotive and firemen.
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. What do you think is scary about organized labor
Well, I mean,
for some people?
so you're talking about not the bosses, just outsiders.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's a good question. I mean, I assume that it comes across as an organization that makes deals
Mm-hmm.
and they work for their own benefit and you're not a part of it.
Yeah.
So it's a group of people who are making things happen, and these are not things that you have any involvement in or any benefit from directly.
Yeah.
Because I don't think most people think of the sort of way that if standards go up and with workers at one place, it will impact people positively in other place.
Right.
So a lot of times that connection is not obvious to most people. And I think that's probably why there are some people who are a little bit leery of unions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Eugene Debs is radicalized in prison. He becomes a part of this, I would say, socialist group after going to prison. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, before we get to his prison stint, I'd like to talk about some of his earlier strike activities. I mean,
Sure.
like early on, the union he belonged to was the BLF, so
Yes.
the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen.
That's right.
And just like the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, it was a relatively conservative
Yes.
union in the sense that they thought of themselves as being separate from other labor and that they were just working for their own interests very narrowly.
That's right.
And so the idea, sort of the difference between, I guess what we might call it conservative labor versus radical labor, is whether you perceive labor as being limited to your profession or to all labor.
Yes.
And so he actually started off in more of the conservative end of things, and he actually was not a big fan of strikes. He thought that strikes were counterproductive.
That is right. That is absolutely correct.
And a lot of that came from what happened back in 1877, the Great Railroad Strike, which was a flaming failure for labor. And it was ended with a great deal of violence, especially from the Pinkertons and from the U.S. government.
That's right. That's right.
And so Debs, because of that happening when he was a young man, he had the impression that strikes were a last resort.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But he'll get involved in a couple of them, and actually he's going to become really well known for strikes, but ironically enough, he was not a big advocate of them.
Right.
So the first one he'll be involved with heavily is the Burlington Railroad Strike of 1888.
Mm-hmm.
And what this involved was the skilled workers got together, so engineers, locomotive firemen, switchmen, and they struck against the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad,
That's right.
which was very influential throughout the Midwest. And what they were asking for was fairly basic stuff: higher wages, seniority rights, if you worked there for a while, grievance procedures, so relatively normal,
Mm-hmm.
everyday stuff. But they were only advocating for those three skilled positions. And the real sort of catalyst for this is that one of their members who had brought these petitions up before, who had been an engineer, had been one of the guys who was then fired randomly, kind of, where
Mm-hmm.
he claims he was fired because he was late, but he says the watch that they used to determine that he was late was faulty.
That's right.
So kind of shady circumstances given that he is bringing these conditions forward. Well, so this then sort of sparks the strike, and the skilled workers assume that the railroad won't get by without them. So they figure it will end pretty quickly. It doesn't. It goes on for 10 months, and ultimately they're just replaced by scabs,
Mm-hmm.
or strike breakers, whatever
Right.
term you prefer.
Right.
And so again, this kind of reinforces Debs's perception that strikes don't really work.
Absolutely. And also, strikes don't really work. Oftentimes, think of the time period, scabs are oftentimes African Americans, Black Americans from the South were used as strike breakers to pit it against those railroad strikers to say, hey, we have someone else who can do this job for cheaper. So I agree that was a way that Eugene Debs was saying strikes. Yeah, I get the point of striking, but these companies, industry, right? They're going to find someone to do the job for cheaper. And in fact, that, according to, there's several sources, but according to one of my favorite books, it's by Dr. Lumpkin. It's called American Program. He talks about how that potentially was the catalyst for the riot in East St. Louis, Illinois, in 1917. Like these strike breakers were brought in and used as scabs, to manipulate the system and the owners of industry. So yeah, Eugene Debs was pretty right on that in the beginning, because scabs are always used as people to kind of undercut the cost.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, probably the most common strike-breaking tactic is just to try to replace the workers who are upset with different workers. And the railroads, for the most part, were able to do that pretty successfully throughout the late 1800s, and a lot of that has to do with the government pretty much exclusively siding with the railroad companies over labor. Also, it's interesting that back in this, we tend today to think of the media as being sort of liberal-leaning. Whereas if you read the newspapers this period, they are also very much 100% with management, and in lockstep with management, because most journalists came from a wealthy background.
Yes.
And they had no sympathy whatsoever for labor. And we'll see that especially in the way the Pullman strike is reported.
Yes.
But yeah, so I mean, during this time, strikes didn't get a lot of public support because they were the strikers themselves were demonized, and they were labeled as anarchists or communists. Well, actually, that term doesn't really exist yet, but
right,
anarchists certainly did.
Anarchists, yeah.
Or just people who are upsetting the apple cart of society and interrupting your ability to move cargo or take a passenger train or whatever it might be. So Debs was well aware that it would be very difficult to build up enough support to get this done, to have the public side with you and put pressure on powers that be.
Indeed. The individuals who own the mean of production, for sure.
And so up to this point, Debs really is not a big theory guy from what I understand. I mean, he's more or less just a practice person when it comes to labor issues, and he does have a lot of experience with the BLF. He edits their newspaper, so he's pretty well engaged. He goes to conferences, he's well connected, and especially in the 1880s when he's, in his late 20s and 30s, he seems to have a lot of political aspirations as well during that time.
Absolutely.
But mostly through the Democratic Party as sort of the mainstream of it.
Right. And the Democratic Party of this particular time period, we're talking about, I like to take Reconstruction all the way to the Plessy case, so 1896, but your textbooks will probably say 1877, but I like to take it all the way to the Plessy case, where we are divided as a nation. But yes, you're right, the Democratic Party at that time is in contrast to what the Democratic Party is now, today.
Right. So, it's not nearly the same. And, I guess also the Republicans are fairly comparable to what they are now, though, I'd say.
Well, yeah, Abraham Lincoln was an attorney for the railroad. So, they've always been the party of business. However, their focus shifted throughout the years. So, unfortunately, this is unfortunate, but when the focus shift throughout the years, whatever side civil rights was on, the Republicans were on the opposite side.
Yeah.
But that's just because of that Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Right. Yeah, because I guess up to that point, a lot of the biggest pushers of civil rights were actually like New England Republicans.
Yeah. And then Goldwater comes in. But yes, I agree. Yes.
Yeah, so it's
and those Dixiecrats began to support the Republican Party simply because of
Yeah, so
civil rights.
When Debs was coming in, this is, I guess there's enough time that's passed since the Civil War that Democrats can be semi-viable again. They're still definitely the minority party, though, to be clear. But he's able to get elected in Terre Haute, and he's a city clerk for a couple terms.
Yes.
He gets to the General Assembly of Indiana for one term.
Yes.
And he also, at one point, made an unsuccessful bid to go to the U.S. House. So he is someone who seems to have some political ambition that goes beyond his labor activism, and his views on labor are pretty mainstream within the Democratic Party, where he thinks that labor and capital should work together
Yeah.
rather than being antagonistic. And that will start to change in 1888 with the previous strike we talked about, the Burlington Railroad strike, but it will really radically change with the Pullman strike.
Yes.
And especially in the year or two before it, and then when he's in prison after it. I mean, that's really where he becomes the Debs that we know.
Right, right. And that's usually kind of the meat and potatoes of most textbooks and most, biographies about Debs. But what I wish people, when they speak about Debs in the Pullman strike, I wish they would go in some more detail about who George Pullman was, and how, he pretty much, monopolized Chicago, with he owned the homes that the workers lived in, took money directly out of their paycheck.
Right.
Just complete ridiculous, type of tactics. And George Pullman, some of my relatives were Pullman porters. He was an interesting guy. In fact, he made a point to hire Black Americans for the purpose of this nostalgia of servitude. Yes.
Oh.
He did. Oh yeah. He made a point to hire Black men to be servile, to kind of give this yesteryear feel to white passengers on his trains.
In the Chicago area, would there be nostalgia for that?
Remember, those trains went all over the United States, and those Pullman porters were, if it wasn't for them, a lot of, literature wouldn't have been delivered to the South about the Great Migration, the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier. All that type of communication came by way of those Pullman porters. But yeah, George Pullman had a tactic. He had a strategy. Indeed. He had a whole maid category where he hired certain women to kind of, again, provide this nostalgia to some people, like Southerners on the train. This romanticizing antebellum, the United. Oh yes, antebellum South. Interesting guy.
Was he from the South at all, or?
He was not.
Okay.
He was not. He was a businessman. That's what businessmen do, or people. Excuse me. That's what business people do, man or woman or whoever. That's what business people do. You find a niche. You find where a vacancy is located, and you find a way to monetize it.
Yes, I guess he sort of found his. That was sort of his gimmick. Was the Black porters were a big part of it then.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yes. This is a romanticized. It's Gone with the Wind. That's It's very Gone with the Wind. This is a trip to the past where you can feel like, But most of those Pullman porters, they received most of their money from the tips. The tips, because George Pullman was frugal.
Yeah, I guess that's a polite way to say
yes.
it.
Trying to be polite.
From what I understand too, with his,
they call me mean. So.
With the well, he's a titan of industry in the Gilded Age.
Yes.
They're not exactly known for their gentle ways.
Right.
He also apparently during the Panic of 1893, when there was obviously a big downturn in the economy, his solution was to tell his workers, "Guess what? Your pay got cut by 28%."
And my point exactly.
And I'm probably not going to restore it, but anyway, you still got a job.
Wow.
So that's how Pullman handled that situation.
Wow.
And so it's safe to say, I think he's not exactly a hero with the working people of the rail industry.
No. But he, that's kind of what gets under my skin a little bit about these History Channel documentaries. He's considered like an industrialist, an engineer, and all that stuff. But they never talk about like him being that's exploitation. Like when someone lives in your town, you take the money directly out of their wages.
Mm-hmm.
They work for you, that's complete exploitation.
I imagine he got a lot of his inspiration from looking at how mine towns were run. If he's taking things out of people's paycheck, 'cause that's a way to make sure people feel like they have to keep showing up. And apparently, he also was responsible to a lot of investors in Boston, mostly.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
So whenever you have investors who are from a different part of the country, then what limited sympathy they might have for the workers in their own area is not going to apply at all.
I agree, and that makes sense because if he's from New York, so yeah, that makes sense that he would have those connections to the East Coast, for lack of better words. But yeah, complete exploitation. The Pullman Company town, that was
Oh man.
yeah. Not only do you work for me, you can live here as well. Yeah.
I'm sure those were some really nice dwellings too.
Yeah. That is insane.
Yeah, that's I didn't know about that. That's,
Absolutely. Yeah.
well, so
it's insane. And in fact, I want to say now it's like south. It's in Chicago, but it's like south of Chicago.
yeah.
But yes, absolutely.
So sort of the origin of the Pullman strike and then Debs' role in it would be that Debs in 1893 actually left the union he'd been affiliated with to found what was known as the IRA, and what was it? Does that have IRA right or?
Yes.
Okay, so it's the Association of Railroad Workers.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the idea is that all railroad workers would be involved, especially the unskilled, because he saw the failure in 1888 as only involving the skilled workers, and without that solidarity with the unskilled, then the unskilled workers were just going to step into the engineering and locomotive fireman roles.
Yes.
Because they're going to get a promotion. So if you have everybody working together, that's the only way to protect anyone in the system. So that was his new theory of labor, and I think to this very day that is what almost all labor activists believe, is that you have to have solidarity among different parts of the same industry to have any real shot of doing anything. So he's one of the first to really fully recognize that.
Yeah, and yes, I agree, and it's crazy because, like, what were people thinking before Eugene Debs decided to take that step?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it was still the traditional view of, well, our little guild here will advance our interest or protect us, and our bosses will respect us, and it will be okay because we have a skill.
Yeah.
Because people can't learn new skills and replace us,
Yes.
I guess. But also a lot of the earlier unions, like the one he had belonged to for the firemen, the engineers and the firemen on the locomotives, a lot of those also were not about collective bargaining. A lot of them were more about benefits and also just them pulling the resources together and having brotherhood.
Wow.
So it's more like a social club in many ways.
Yes. That is correct. That goes back to Pullman, the sleeping car porters, because George Pullman, his railroads were sleeping cars, like over the road sleeping cars. So people would take a trip from, for example, New York to Chicago on these sleeping car trains. So yes, that's pretty factual. Absolutely, indeed, yeah.
Pullman's cars that he manufactured were used by a whole lot of railroads, and so the idea is when there's that 28% pay cut that's not restored after the panic's over, a lot of the members of the new IRA go to Debs and demand a strike. And once again, after what had happened before, he's very reluctant to enter into this. But his membership is overwhelmingly in favor of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then one of the leaders of the workers down in St. Louis then joins in too. So now it's kind of gotten away from Debs and it's just happening, so he'll eventually sign on. But up to this point, he is not a big fan of the idea of doing the Pullman strike in 1894.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But he will become the person most associated with it, ironically enough.
Yes.
In fact, he's easily the face of it.
Easily, yes. Absolutely. Do you think it was his charisma that attracted made him popular when it comes to that particular strike? Because many people were involved.
I think it must be his charisma, because he, by this point, was a fully developed orator. and he was able to really keep an audience engaged. He apparently borrowed a lot of sort of preacher speaking style
Oh
pretty
yes.
effectively, and so he had really developed into a captivating speaker.
Mm-hmm.
So he was the person most associated with it, the most popular figure involved. And I guess the media at the time wanted to demonize him to delegitimate the whole process. What they didn't realize, though, is that because he is charismatic, that putting his name out there is actually doing him a huge favor.
Absolutely, absolutely. The cadence to his speaking voice, it drew people in. I agree 100%. Mm-hmm.
So, as the strike proceeds, it will not go super well for the unions involved. So there's a federal injunction to end it. So the courts basically say that they can't do this. They ignore the injunction, and then the Pinkertons and the army are sent in to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
And the Pinkertons are called a detective agency, but they don't do much investigation. They do a lot of beating people up, though.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
between them and then just regular scabs are brought in, the strike is ended, and this will be how Debs ends up in prison for the first time.
Indeed, indeed. For the first time.
I think so.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
No,
his first
I
time.
was emphasizing the
But
first
yeah,
time.
so he's not going to be the last, unfortunately, but
Exactly.
it will be.
It was the first time, and I'm
Yeah.
happy you covered that before I jump to the prison part, because, like you said, the prison part is where everyone kind of, they get radicalized and they have time to read
Yeah.
and become more informed. Make great music, write great books in prison.
Yeah.
Right. So, what do you think it was about prison that made Eugene Debs, the Eugene Debs that we know of today? The guy visits him, right? He gets a visit from a socialist that explains that, what he is doing has a name to it.
Yeah. So I've heard two sort of contradictory things about that. One is that Debs himself said that what radicalized him was what happened in the Pullman strike and the use of force by the government.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, not only was he visited by a couple of socialists, but he also had people mailing him books and things. So for the next 6 months or so he was in prison, he was being inundated with messages from socialists telling him, you might not know it, but you are one of us, and here's what we believe.
Yeah.
And then he's thinking, okay, so, all right, I guess that's pretty much the conclusions I've come to
Mm-hmm.
about labor relations and how power works and everything else. So it was one of those things where his life experiences, especially in the last several years, had really made it to where socialism now made 100% sense to him.
That's right. Yeah.
Whereas if he had encountered this 10 years earlier, there's a good chance he would have rejected it.
Wow. Yeah. So he's radicalized. He's reading. Of course, he's reading Marx and Engels. Of course, he's more important than reading is number one. But in addition to reading, he has his own experience as a laborer, right? Being
Right.
exploited, being able to apply what has happened to him. That is, in my opinion, what makes someone more effective. When they've had the experience, they've been able to apply their experience and then explain it. And that is what Eugene Debs did quite effectively.
Right, so he's able to sort of bridge the gap between your socialist theorist and then your average worker.
Absolutely.
And he's pretty ideally situated to do that because he has this combination of, at least a strong foundation for his education. He doesn't have a lot of formal schooling,
Mm-hmm.
but also he's got a lot of practical experience at a number of positions now. So he started out, like I said, cleaning duties and various things, and he was a locomotive engineer. He worked at a grocery store at one point. So he's got a pretty wide range of experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So between those things, he is able to not only understand but explain
Yes.
things in a way that most people simply can't.
Yes. That's well said. People can identify, right? Because if it's happening to me, this is what's happening to you, right?
Yeah.
The light bulb goes off for the majority of the people who are experiencing that aha moment. So yeah,
Yeah.
he's able to resonate and connect with people well, for sure.
Yeah, so this is why he will become pretty much the leading figure in labor now for the rest of his life. So from about, I'd say, 1896 until his death in 1926, he's pretty much the top guy in labor. Um, but he hasn't quite abandoned the Democratic Party yet.
Right.
So even though he's now identifies as a socialist, there is a candidate in 1896 who Debs thinks speaks to his new views, at least a little bit, and that candidate is William Jennings Bryan.
Indeed. Why do you think Williams Jennings Bryan was unrelatable to most Americans? Because he didn't win.
Well, I think the thing about Bryan, he spoke about the issue of gold a lot. So gold was the preferred metal standard of the wealthy.
Right.
And so a lot of people who kind of understood monetary matters understood that silver was more useful for the common person. The thing is, though, because Bryan had a very rural outlook, he actually appealed mostly to kind of people who were rural progressives. So he did well in places like Iowa, but he, for whatever reason, could not really speak to people in cities very well. He really even failed with unions, from what I understand. He was not able to talk their language. He just didn't quite understand the collective struggle of people who work in an industry. And so he would have a pretty good following in the countryside that would never translate.
Right.
And so he lost horribly every time he ran.
Which has always been interesting to me, because Bryant is from Chicago. So, he was born in Illinois. Let me be direct. He was born in Illinois. So, what I'm saying is he's adjacent to all the labor. So I've always been stumped by the fact, like, you're born in Illinois, not Chicago, but you're born in Illinois, so you have at least you're an earshot of the complications of the common person. So yeah, he just didn't resonate. Interesting.
Yeah, at least that's kind of what I've understood about his campaigns, is that he never was able to speak to people in cities, which, again, given his background, is a little odd. And also, it's another indication of how different American politics was then as compared to now, because the idea of like prairie radicalism, the idea that people in Kansas are the kind of lefties in politics is very foreign to us today. But that's how things were in the populist and progressive eras.
Absolutely.
Well, at least the populist era. Maybe it was changing by the progressive era, but so. I don't know, I guess if you could combine Bryan and Debs, you'd probably have a winning candidate.
Yes. Ding.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But, alas, there was no way for them to merge into one, so.
Not at all. He has a little, Bryan, he has some experience in Nebraska, but that's the same thing. You have that Great Migration push, and you still have people moving to Omaha. So the same issues that we've discussed, that applies in cities, was going on in Nebraska and Omaha. So yeah, it's still kind of perplexing that he wasn't able to connect. Personality.
Although he also, interestingly enough, he was similar to Debs in the sense that he also was a really top-notch orator. So the people who attended his speeches were usually entertained and moved to some extent, but I think part of it is just, again, he didn't know how to speak to that urban audience. So workers were not really responsive to Bryan.
Interesting. Yeah. Absolutely.
Whereas I think with Debs, he might have had the opposite problem, where he probably would have a lot of trouble conveying his ideas to a rural audience that had never been in a workplace environment. So we have to remember, a lot of Americans were still small farmers.
Yes.
And so this would have been a hard sell for a lot of people, or trying to understand just the context of living in a place like Chicago and working in the railroad industry would not be an experience they'd be able to really wrap their heads around too easily if they've always worked on their family farm.
And also at this time, I think being a great orator, having great cadence, made Bryant and Debs, more Debs, more attractive, because I'm thinking like literacy rates in some of these areas where they're speaking may not have been as high. Not saying everyone was illiterate, but we're talking about like places where people had to work and school just wasn't You know, and I understand why. Like
Yeah,
that's that. I mean,
makes
those
sense.
things happen. That's called you have to work to provide for your family. And if they did, know a little bit of reading, it came by way of the Bible and things like that. So yeah, I do think that may be why Debs was, his speaking style, as you mentioned, he was able to connect, and he's enthusiastic, and people who may not have had any other type of outlet was able to use him as their mouthpiece, right?
Yeah. So, and I guess Brian also had a similar oratorical style that was also very preacher-like,
Yes.
and so I guess that was just the standard way to become an orator at the time, was just to kind of model it after, especially I guess the more engaging, charismatic preachers of the day.
Yeah.
And it's also worth mentioning that a lot of those preachers who today we'd associate with being a little bit more on the right wing side of things for the most part, back then those kind of evangelicals tended to lean more what we'd think of as left. So,
Yeah.
again, very different time.
Yeah, absolutely. Lincoln was kind of like that with his speaking voices, and the Lincoln Douglas debates. People like to put that in the category of what you just said.
Yeah.
Great speak. Alton, Illinois has statues up there of those debates where they have been having cadence to the voices.
Yeah, and one thing
Preacher
I've tried to mention to students before is that until at least the 19th century, oratory was a form of entertainment too.
Yes.
So it's a thing that people will show up to listen just because what else do they have to do for entertainment? I mean, there aren't too many alternatives. So
Right.
that's why, whether we're talking about the ancient world or the 1900s or 1800s, at least the late 1800s, I mean, you still having the ability to speak really well is a way to engage an audience and a way to
Yes.
spend a Saturday afternoon or whatever it might be. So that's also why people were mad at Lincoln for the Gettysburg Address, because he spoke for 7 minutes,
Yeah.
and they had to ride in a carriage there for hours, and then their president only speaks for 7 minutes, and I can imagine why they were miffed,
Yeah.
because they wanted to get their travels worth
Mhm.
for that speech, but
Mhm.
instead he decided to say it all quickly and leave, and yeah.
There you have it. Yeah, that Gettysburg Address, it's up there. Everyone has their liabilities, so I try not to come down on Lincoln too much, because every time I'm gonna tell you, I've been as an native Illinoisan, I've been studying Lincoln probably since elementary school, because we come out of the womb learning Lincoln if
Yeah.
you're from Illinois. But every time I think I know him, I find something else. I think he was struggling with, because he's an attorney, so he's struggling with how to handle the Constitution, and then also how to deviate and make things better. And that's just me reading. I have some of a book pile of his like letters and his addresses, and the Gettysburg Address is up there. I really like his second inaugural address. He's assassinated, we know that, but man, that second inaugural address that's up there. It's empowering. It talks about just, you brought this on yourself,
Yeah.
gotta deal with it,
Yeah.
and the wolf came.
Yeah, so I mean, it's also, I guess, just in general, once we get past that first generation of American leaders, so once we get past the founding fathers, like the standard of oratory got much higher very quickly.
Yeah.
So apparently, a lot of the founding fathers were fairly tongue-tied, but then once we get to the next generation, they actually can say all this stuff out loud, not just when they're writing.
Yeah.
And so that's still true by the time we get to Debs and Brian and some of these
Yeah.
other figures, and so will still be a while before, I guess, American oratory goes down the toilet. So we still have a couple more generations. Well, even before that, I mean, Harding actually will appear in the story, and Harding was notoriously inept at speaking compared by the standards of the day, at least.
Yeah.
So with Debs, now he will be not only out of prison, but he's going to be looking for other ways to contribute.
Yes.
And so he will move on to found, or at least help found, the Socialist Party and the IWW.
Yes.
So he's going to be again, the leading figure in labor, and his power will peak in the early 1900s, which is now finally a favorable time because we're now in the progressive era.
Mm-hmm.
So labor is going to have a lot more juice than it had before in
Yes.
general, and he's going to be able to really push for what he wants during this time, at least a lot more.
Absolutely, absolutely. The industrial age, you have immigrants coming in also, who are attracted to his ideology, and he becomes a threat, right?
Yeah.
To the means of production, to the powers that be, to the aristocracy. He becomes a threat. This is before child labor laws.
Right.
Women are getting paid less than anyone, if you're getting hired. But again, you hire women for cheap, you don't have to pay males as much, skilled workers. Triangle shirt fire is an example of that. But yes, he picks up steam during this time.
Yeah, so this will be prime Debs, I guess we could say.
Prime.
So now he's going to be able to push for a whole lot of stuff. And while, of course, he will not achieve elected office, and we'll talk about some of his electoral attempts, what he will do is influence enough people that some of his political opponents will start to embrace some of his ideas in order to try to head him off and take away his steam.
Yes.
So, for instance, all these things he advocates for, like we just mentioned, with everything from fire safety standards at
Yes.
factories to fair working conditions, wages, what have you.
Equality.
Equality.
He was
all
ahead
these-
of his time with that.
Yeah, all these things are going to be picked up by various candidates like Theodore Roosevelt, for instance.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely.
I think at one point, didn't Roosevelt say explicitly, the reason I'm picking this up is to make sure Debs doesn't get the power?
Yes.
So,
Yes. That's spoken like a true politician.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Debs was really ahead of his time with the racial equality component, and he influenced a lot of like Philip A. Randolph, going back to the sleeping car porters, the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters, and I don't like the word maids, domestics, but maids, that was the name of it. They organized based on some of Debs' principles.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely. Debs was, he influenced a lot of people, and I think we're still feeling his influence today.
Yeah. I mean, we don't have, I guess child labor is making a comeback in a few states, but for the most part, it's still,
I could not believe that.
Yeah, the times we live in. But for the most part, the reason why we tend to look at child labor as being a relic of the past is because people like Debs pushed to abolish it. And,
Yeah.
So he had an influence, even if it was a little bit more indirect.
Yeah.
But-
Absolutely.
So he actually will run for president 5 times during this era.
Ding.
So 1900, 1904, 1908, 1912, and then 1920.
Absolutely. Consecutively, right?
Well, he does skip 1916 for some reason.
Oh, that's right. 12 and 20. That's right. He did.
So I don't know why he skipped 1916, but I guess
Revamp. Reality troops.
maybe either that, or maybe he just let somebody else run. I'm not sure. But yeah, so I guess he must be up there with Bryan in terms of running for a president a number of times as a nominee of a party.
He is, and he runs on the socialist ticket.
Yeah,
as
so
well.
he'll actually run on an official socialist ticket.
Right.
And this is still pre-Red Scare, so the word socialist is not quite as
Thunderous.
Is not quite as demonized as it will be from 1920 forward, but it's still not something that's super popular.
Mm-hmm. Which brings me, do you think Debs initiated that uptick in socialism being seen as the big bad wolf?
It could be, because I guess he brings the movement to a level of popularity to where people actually kind of know what it is a little bit.
Yes.
Or at least they know somebody's a socialist probably at some
Yeah.
point. So I imagine that's partly why labor, especially not labor leaders, business leaders, want to find someone to paint in a negative light, and Debs is there as pretty much, I guess, really probably the only household name at this point in labor,
Right.
or at least one of the very few. So I guess they would have to smear him primarily. And then they notice his votes are taking up. So I mean, 1900 he gets 0.6% of the vote.
Mm-hmm.
Then in 1904 he gets 3%. He holds steady. 1908, so he goes down to 2.8, but it's still about like, I think that's still better than what the Green Party gets usually.
Actually, yeah, you're right.
I mean, so it's still like, because people blame Jill Stein and others
Yeah.
for throwing elections, but Debs actually got a little more.
Absolutely.
And then in 1912, the famous, it's now a four-way race because of Debs being popular enough. But 1912, he gets 6%.
Mm-hmm.
This is running against Theodore Roosevelt, Taft,
Taft.
and Wilson.
Yeah.
And these are all fairly well-regarded candidates at the time.
With, solidified parties, Democratic Party, Republican parties, absolutely. And which brings me to think, we have the Bolshevist Revolution in 1917.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty sure some of that influence crossed the water.
Could be. It's hard to say, because I know, because the basic idea of socialism, I mean, there are people who have argued that socialism predates Marx.
Yeah, I've heard that argument.
And I mean, but I guess too, with Debs in particular in 1912, we've got to think about the circumstances of him doubling his vote total. Where,
Yes.
So the Republicans are split between Roosevelt
Split the vote.
and Taft. So the Democrats are more motivated because they have the chance to reclaim the White House for the first time in 30 years.
Yes.
So they're excited, they're motivated, and yet somehow Debs still doubles his vote total.
Yeah.
And this was an election where any of those big three candidates could have won.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's still able to peel off that much support.
Agree.
And also, none of them ran super conservative platforms. So, I mean, the most conservative would be Taft, but he was actually fairly moderate if you look at his platform.
And indeed, and it's important that we say, because Wilson was bait and switch. We know what Wilson did to the United States as far as like race relations, but he didn't run on that ticket.
Right.
He was definitely bait and switch for sure. He got in the White House and said, "Psych."
Well, because I feel like he actually did a lot of things he said he was going to do, but then he did some other stuff too that he didn't run on. And
like segregating D.C. and getting all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, he turned out to be, the wolf in sheep's clothing.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, all these candidates kind of ran as progressives, and a lot of the reason they did so is because of the pressure from Debs.
Yes.
Because Debs was clearly getting a following, and his movement was building.
Yes, absolutely.
And so it was a four-way race with no conservative candidates.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of an interesting dynamic, and that's probably about the absolute peak of Debs.
Yeah.
And really, honestly, socialism in America up to this point.
Yeah.
So,
absolutely. Absolutely. What do you think it was, so the height of Debs, yes, but do you think it was, because the Bolsheviks influenced the United States, we had an entire, especially in places like Alabama, Kansas, we mentioned that, but then you had that entire Red Scare that pretty much targeted anyone who had a brain out, could be deemed a socialist. That whole Red Scare, McCarthy,
Yeah. Well, because I don't know as much about the Red Scare of the 1920-ish,
Mm-hmm.
but from what I understand, it was actually more hysterical than the McCarthy era.
Mm-hmm.
And partly it's because nobody really understood what Bolshevism was.
Mm-hmm.
And they also assumed that it would mean that, I guess, some foreign influence would somehow take over the country from, a shattered Russia that couldn't keep itself fed. Somehow it's gonna, I don't know, and take over America. So it's just they took advantage of a kind of hysteria over the fact that this country's government had been completely overthrown by workers,
Mm-hmm.
more or less.
Mm-hmm.
And so they began to look at somebody like Debs as being a Lenin figure, or at least a potential Lenin.
That's pretty much, you need to scare people away from him, control the narrative on him. Absolutely, that's pretty much the way I kind of viewed the decline of Debs.
Yeah, although it's interesting because despite literally making him a criminal, it doesn't kill socialism as a whole.
Agree.
It's actually his resilience is kind of amazing if you look at his numbers when he runs in 1920 from prison.
Yes.
So he actually did run as a candidate from prison.
Yay, yay.
And he still got 3.4% of the vote.
Absolutely.
And this is also in a conservative-leaning year where people are tired of what they see as progressivism as a whole, but also tired of the adventurism abroad of Wilson.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a reaction and sort of a wave in favor of the Republicans.
Absolutely.
And isolationism. And Debs is a guy who's always talked about international labor. He was the leader of the Wobblies, who
Yes,
International
he was.
World, I forget what the acronym stands for, but they have a very international flavor to them.
Yes.
So you could plausibly, if you're just playing word association, say that he is linked to the Bolsheviks because it's international.
Right.
So despite all of that, and despite him going to prison for being anti-war or being a sympathizer of this, that, or the other, he still does better than he did in 1904, 1908.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And talk about how, he was ridiculously convicted on the Espionage Act.
Yeah, so I
Crazy.
mean, once Woodrow kept us out of the war only to get us into it in 1917, they passed an Espionage Act, which made it effectively a crime of treason if you protest the war, because it's helping and abetting America's enemies to protest the war. And Eugene Debs was very much against wars in general, because he saw it as workers being forced to murder each other in these mass industrialized conflicts.
Absolutely.
And so he actually, once again, kind of wanted to stay out of it a little bit, but then some of the other labor leaders were getting involved, and he figured, I don't want them to take the bullet here. So I figure maybe because I'm prominent enough, maybe if I start doing it, maybe they won't actually throw people in prison for it, because it'll be mainstream enough that you can't actually do that. You bet wrong.
Yeah.
Because he gets arrested and put in prison, 1918, 1919?
10 years.
Yeah, and he was a 10-year sentence. And as part of it, he runs for president in 1920. So again, this year where he's literally imprisoned for espionage.
Yeah.
And he can't campaign for obvious reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Still gets 3.4% of the vote.
He has a following.
Yeah. So that means that there were at least a pretty good number of people who saw through the smoke on this one.
Absolutely. Lincoln did that too during the Civil War.
Yeah.
Took away civil liberties. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think Lincoln's situation is a little different than Wilson and Debs.
Yeah.
I think Wilson being in prison on espionage was related to exactly what you just said, his following. He's a threat to society. He's a threat. Lobbyists and industrialists and the government, they're linked always, even today.
Yeah.
So, I think that there was other alternative motives with Debs being in prison.
Yeah, and to backtrack to the Lincoln analogy for a minute, I guess you would know. So I know Lincoln did put some people in prison for protesting the war, but how many of them were actually on the same equivalent level of prominence as someone like a Debs?
Not many. There was one, Willingham. He was a politician, but nothing like Debs. Didn't have the influence and the following that Debs had.
Okay, so I guess that's probably why Debs thought he would be okay, just because if these other figures from back then had been critical of the war and gotten away with it, then surely this conflict, which is clearly far less existential for the United States,
habeas corpus,
would not see a president go quite that far. But I guess Debs maybe, depending on how you think about it, either over or underestimated Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah.
And so he ended up in jail.
10 years. Aged him.
Oh yeah.
I think the purpose of that sentence, because it didn't have to be 10 years, you know that, right? Yeah. I think that was intentional to say that's enough time to, your followers will follow someone else, right? But after 10 years, they'll find something else that catches their attention, and it won't be you. People will forget about you. So I think that sentence was intentional, and that's a shame.
Yeah, I mean, I think too the thing that really killed his movement was the IWW was portrayed as being treasonous as a whole.
Right.
and Debs's health was badly damaged, as you said. I mean, he'll spend his last couple years in a sanatorium, but in his case, it was for his heart, not for his mental health.
Yeah.
And so his movement's fizzling out. It's also the 20s will be a very conservative decade, both in terms of government policy and public mood.
Mm-hmm.
And so between those things, his movement will fizzle out. IWW disbands. The Democratic Party will move hard away from labor.
Yes.
So their next nominee will be John Davis, who is almost anti-labor, or at least neutral. And then after that, the Democrats run as far as they can from labor until FDR, pretty much.
That's right. Yeah.
And even then, I think he kind of embraces it after he's elected. I don't think he even runs on anything like that.
Yeah. No, he doesn't.
So, I mean, the Democratic Party's run away from him completely. The Republicans have abandoned all progressivism with Harding.
Yep.
Although Harding, to his credit, will actually commute the sentence against Debs.
He does.
In 1921.
Yep.
To restore normalcy, as he would say.
Absolutely. Indeed.
So unlike Debs, Harding was not the most eloquent guy. And normalcy is actually not a real word until Harding. So this word should have been normality, but it said normalcy, and he got made fun of it for it. But then people thought, well, this actually sounds kind of good, and they started using it. So.
Normalcy it is.
Yeah.
And we can't forget about the young lady, Kate O'Hare, who was kind of an adjacent Eugene Debs-ish type of advocate. She wasn't as progressive as Eugene Debs because, well, let's just say she could have been more open to civil rights. So she was in the same category as Eugene Debs and what he advocated for, but Eugene Debs, although for equality, he understood that individuals were being manipulated, the entire divide and conquer strategy among the races being used as scabs and all of that. So he was progressive in that particular category, but Kate O'Hare, not so much. She didn't really believe in like integrated industry. She said some really crazy stuff like, yeah, socialism is good, but I'm afraid, that white women will be working next to black men and stuff. But she was in prison for her socialist views. Yeah, she also was in prison on the Espionage Act. So a woman, 5 years.
Man.
Yeah, same. So the same thing, but like I said, not as progressive as Eugene Debs. He was a little ahead of his time when it came to understanding just how people were used against each other for other people's benefit.
And I guess both of their arrests would correspond with Leighton Wilson's term, because the first term he was relatively pro-labor. And then the second term, especially that second half of the term, he got kind of bitter against labor.
Yeah.
And this also is the period, I guess Debs would still be in prison, but there's that big strike in West Virginia.
Yes.
The one the term is really bloody.
Yes.
And Wilson is responsible for sicking in the troops, or at least setting it up to where his successor will. I forget exactly. But anyway, he had completely bailed on labor by the time he ended his presidency. And probably just what put both Debs and O'Hare away.
Yeah. Uniting workers against industry, being an advocate for labor, has always been threatening to the United States.
Yeah.
And that's a shame. Yeah. That's a shame. I mean, we can apply that to current Amazon, right? They're trying to unionize. Some of them are unionized.
A decent number of the warehouses are now. It's only because of some really horrendous practices that got, basically revived the labor movement. Like in Columbus, where I used to live, Columbus, Ohio, the warehouse there, not only would they not allow you to wear a coat when it's cold because they're afraid you're going to smuggle out goods, but they determined that it would be cheaper to have an ambulance on standby than to have AC in the summer when it gets hot.
Wow.
And so there were people who would drop dead on the job site or have a heart attack or whatever.
Unbelievable.
And so that was happening, and they were able to get away with it because they circumvented all the state labor laws by building in an international zone or whatever bullshit category they invented for this.
Yeah.
But anyway, they're in an international zone somehow that doesn't have state labor regulations.
Wow.
And so that's how they're able to get away with that. And so, the Amazon unionization is not hard to figure out why it happened when you look in individual circumstances.
Yeah.
And they still have drivers peeing in bottles and.
That is exploitation to the core.
Yeah.
Not picking on Amazon, but man, like what you just described is brutal.
No, it is, and it's also odd to me because to get back to like we're talking about the racial stances of Debs and O'Hare.
Yeah.
So the reason why someone like Debs would be more dangerous to the powerful ultimately is because I knew a lot of people, especially after 2016, where there was this hysteria over Trump being racist, who said that basically labor issues are white issues.
Interesting.
Which, the funny thing though, most of those workers who were being abused by Amazon in Columbus were the black workers who had been perpetually unemployed since the time of the steel plants closing down. So, I had somebody tell me with a straight face, like, yeah, well, that's kind of like a white issue.
Labor?
I'm like, yeah, they told me that labor's a white issue. I'm like, so people of color don't work? I mean, like, what are you talking about?
What was their justification for that?
I guess it's only white people care about that kind of stuff, which, is news to me and news to everybody I've ever known. But
they don't know much history because, labor unions go all the way back. You had washerwomen, maids, domestics who all were unionizing in the South because, of course, people know American history. And if they don't know American history, you should look this up. There was a time when black women would only be able to find employment as domestics, right? And those women unionized. Some states tried to shut it down, but people like that, you kind of, if you have the time, you can educate them. But I've been in that situation where you just don't have the energy.
Yeah, this is the same person who said that Trump got elected because of suburban dads becoming sexist because they watch James Bond movies in their basement.
Yeah, that guy. Good luck with that.
Yeah.
Whoever said that. Yeah.
Yeah. At that point, I realized this isn't worth it.
Yeah.
Exactly. Let this one go.
You're too far gone.
We're moving on.
I've been there.
Yeah.
And stuff like that kind of eat it. You're like, where were you educated? Like, how do you come up with this type of stuff?
Well, this is somebody who does at least medieval history, which I guess is not directly related, but still, I don't know where some of this stuff comes from.
Yeah.
Sometimes I hear takes that are not so much hot takes as they're just in a different dimension.
Right. Clearly the stratosphere. Like I said, Brotherhoods of the Sleeping Car Portament, like A. Philip Randolph, like all that stuff is available if people are interested. But people like that are stuck in their ways. But you made an excellent point. The coal mines, the steel industry, you're right.
Yeah.
When those places close down, the only thing those workers own is their labor. So they need someone else to come in where they can train and become a skilled laborer or an unskilled laborer, whatever pays the bills. And Amazon knew that, right? They saw the void, they went in, and they felt, like you mentioned, in places like Columbus, oh, well, these people need employment. I can kind of get away with some stuff, right? That's what they think. And that's always kind of been the argument of the owners of the means of production. Like, we're doing you a favor. That's kind of been like their perspective, some of them. And I don't agree. I feel like the workers, if you didn't have those workers, that company wouldn't be operating.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that I think Debs was good at highlighting was the importance of workers being able to have a say in their own lives, because a lot of it boils back down to democracy, of having some say in how you live your life. You can't really be free if you are effectively a slave for X number of hours a day.
Good point. Yeah.
So that's why he believed in things like collective bargaining.
Yes.
Which is the real, in many ways, was seen as the real danger of these strikes by a lot of the labor leaders. I mean, I think in the 1888 strike we talked about. There's at least one person who thinks the reason why the unions were resisted, why the bosses wouldn't agree to relatively mild demands, is simply because they were afraid they would establish the precedent of collective bargaining.
Yes, and like I said, that's always been an effective tactic throughout American history. divide and conquer, right? You have these black workers who need employment opportunities. You need white workers who need the same employment opportunities to earn wages to support their family. But how can you divide these guys to where they don't have the power? One feels better than the other. How can I use them against each other? And it's unfortunate that people don't see that, you know. But I think it can be unique to the United States when it comes to that divide and conquer tactic. Because I see it so clearly, right? You have all these people in the same economic class who could benefit from the same job, but you have to pit them against each other, and as a result, the person who owns the industry is laughing and using them against each other. Where do you think Eugene Debs went wrong? Or do you think he went wrong on anything?
I don't really think he went wrong. I think he just he was not in a position to do much more than he did.
Yeah.
I think he might have maxed out or come close to maxing out what he could have done at the time.
Yeah.
I'd have to really look into it to see where he could have improved here or there, but I don't think he could have made too many dramatic improvements, though. I mean, what do you think?
No, I don't think he could have done much. I think he did. I mean, we have to think of the time period, you know. No, I agree. I don't think he could have done more than he did. You're running against these Democrats who have been established, right, since back in the day, you know, Jefferson era. Same thing with the Republicans, although they've evolved, we know that, but they already have a reputation, right?
Yeah.
So that gives them steam. But do you think Debs could win today?
Good question. I mean, so one thing, to go back to the oratory, one reason why, if somebody were to actually hear his speeches today, they probably wouldn't go over as well, but just given his general aptitu's for speaking, that would be useful. But he'd have to change his style dramatically because the verbose style of that era would not translate. Just like Lincoln's Gettysburg Address today is a masterpiece, but back then it pissed people off.
It did.
So, you know, you have to adapt, but I think he could. In terms of his labor theory, I think his labor theory is still the one that people have today.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I think, if you look at the successes, what's that guy with the UAW right now? Sean Fain.
That's right.
I mean, Sean Fain is, you know, a rising star at the moment.
Superstar.
And I don't think he's got anywhere near the kind of charisma Debs probably had. I don't know, though. I mean, because, you know, I don't know if there's any footage of Debs, but, you know, Sean Fain's just kind of like straightforward. There's not really a lot of fluff or nonsense. It just kind of says things bluntly but effectively.
The message, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so he's just an ordinary guy who can get things done.
That's right.
Kind of like, and in Britain, there's a similar thing going on right now. There's a labor leader called Mick Lynch, who's very effective, and he's, you know, he's pushing the Labour Party from labor, the actual labor, and pushing them to actually work with labor, as their name implies they do.
Yeah.
And he's building up quite a following to the point where they gave up on trying to demonize him, and they'll let him on podcasts and stuff now. So, you know,
he's accepted.
Yeah, so I mean, they can't really deny him, but so much because he just makes too much sense.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. You can't deny someone that's beginning to make sense, and that's where Sean Fain comes in. Well, he's actually from Indiana too, actually.
Yeah, I think
he's
so.
from Indiana as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, you know, it's people from those places we like to call the Rust Belt or the Midwest, places that have been left behind. They have a gripe. They know what exploitation is. They have a legit gripe. What do you think scares people about socialism? Because remember, it was weaponized during the Obama administration.
Yeah.
It was weaponized. Like, what do you think scares Americans? Let me be direct. Right. Americans about socialism.
Well, I mean, I know for the older generation, it was the indoctrination they went through during the Cold War years about it being this foreign influence that wants to destroy America and is anti-freedom and this, that, and the other.
Yeah.
At this point, I think part of the reason why the word is becoming unstigmatized is not only that you have, you know, people like Bernie Sanders using it, and he's just not that scary at the end of the day, or whatever. But I think too, a lot of it is just that it's becoming increasingly diluted by overuse. So I think at one point it represented the ideology of some foreign power that was a threat, or at least that's how it was used. And now it's becoming just saturated. So anytime somebody on the right disagrees with anything, it's socialist somehow, even if it has literally nothing to do with class relations or labor or anything.
So, you are 100% spot on with that. And that is something that I am experiencing with this critical race theory football. Anything that is related to American history that makes people feel uncomfortable or embarrassed, critical race theory, you shut down.
Right.
And that's unfortunate because as the common, history, you have to learn from it so you don't repeat it. Not only so you don't repeat it, so that you know where you've been, so it doesn't happen again. And it really upsets me because, like, Nazi Germany, that happened, and they never want people to forget in Germany about what happened, the Holocaust. There's, if anyone's ever been to Germany, there's always some type of plaque there that talks about it. They don't glorify Hitler or anything like that. They want to remember what happened so it doesn't happen again. And unfortunately, as a historian, every time I bring up something that's embarrassing to our history, it's critical race theory. The students go run and tell.
Well, see,
She's teaching critical race theory
it's
because
funny.
she said Thomas Jefferson slept with his slaves.
Well, I mean, you can only...
Good luck with that.
Yeah, you can only have a sex scandal as a theory, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, it's something that you have to study some marks before you can go have your sex scandal. I mean, we all know that.
I really, it really strikes a nerve with me because it's very much like socialism, like you said, like anything. It's not even related to classism. It's just giving people nice health care.
Yeah.
That's socialist. Like anything that wants to shut down.
And I mean, I guess, to a certain extent, I mean, yeah, improving the healthcare system does involve some socialism.
Yeah.
But so does the public library or the
Exactly.
post office being subsidized, so we don't have to pay what we'd have to pay at like FedEx or UPS.
I like having a free library card.
Yeah, I mean, those things are all socialist.
Yeah.
And people don't complain about it. Or having roads that are subsidized that you can drive down without paying a toll every time. I mean, those things are all socialist.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the thing is, I wish people would recognize there is an extent to which every person is socialist.
Yeah.
The extent varies, but just talking about socialism as an evil or being either socialist or not, I think is misleading and inaccurate. It's just not the case that everybody relies on socialism to some extent.
Yeah.
We all do.
Yeah.
It's a spectrum.
Yeah.
It's not a black or white or on and off thing. Everybody's socialist to some extent by practice.
People shut down
Yeah.
when they hear something about, and it's a political football. I get it, and I really hope that people can laugh at it and realize that it's being utilized as a political football. Socialism has been used. When the Tea Party came out back in the day with Obama, former President Obama, and they started kicking around that political football of socialism, and I thought that was the craziest thing ever, and I didn't take it serious.
Yeah. Because
I'm like, this is a joke. Like, you can't be serious, And that's the same way I feel about, like I said, critical race theory. This is a culture wars. This will pass. Anyone who's lived long enough, anyone who's older than TikTok, know that this will pass, right?
And that thing
this
too,
will pass.
So I mean, I guess you would know about this, but I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but critical race theory, that's something you only really learn if you go pretty deep in the grad school, right? That's like a fairly specialized thing.
It is. It's taught in law schools. Yeah, it is. It's not something that's taught in the classroom. Definitely not in the P-12 system. Definitely not. But like I said, anything that has a scope of racial truth is categorized as critical race theory. That's unfortunate because United States, we have to grapple with our past. I was telling students recently about the Naturalization Act of 1790, where you had only white people can be citizens. and no one had. How could you get to this level and not have heard of that, right? And I'm sure that'll be considered critical race theory. That's 1790, right? That's right off the back of the ratification of the Constitution. Like, how does that get bypassed in your textbook? That should be unfathomable.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and part of it's just, I think, part of what leads to that is just that a lot of the textbooks, especially for K-12 system, a lot of it is, I think it's just a very strong civility bias that people don't want to, present unpleasantness, or they think that presenting the unpleasantness is inappropriate or in some way anti-patriotic.
And you know what? That you made an excellent point. That's probably in a nutshell. They see it as not liking your country. They see it as unpatriotic. But I see it as being patriotic, right?
Yeah.
I see it as, of all these faults that has happened, we still like you.
Yeah.
I see that as being the most patriotic, right? It's like a bad relationship, almost. It's like, you've picked up a couple pounds, you sleep a little longer than I would like, but I still like you.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of how America is. It's like, you're right, that people see when you talk about the past, it's uncomfortable, and it's supposed to be uncomfortable. Slavery is supposed to be uncomfortable. There's something wrong with you if you're comfortable with hearing about some of these ideas that we propose to people. But that is what it is. They view it as being unpatriotic.
Yeah.
And that's the opposite. And I wish people would understand it. It's being patriotic. Right? It's saying, no, we still like you in spite of. We can point out, that fat zit in the middle of your forehead, but we still like it, right?
Yeah. So I mean, yeah,
or we
exactly.
still want to fix it. How about that? We want to revamp it.
Yeah, it's not a denunciation or a complete rejection. It's it's just acknowledging what has happened and looking for paths forward that will be hopefully better. I guess the one of the opposite ways of dealing with that would be the Japanese model, where they just pretend Imperial Japan never happened.
Yes.
so I mean, in America, they'll talk about slavery.
That is hilarious.
You have slavery and you have civil rights movement, but I get the impression that everything in between is very loose.
Yeah.
Kind of like, well, let's not worry too much about what was in between. We had the civil rights movement and everything's cool.
Martin Luther King and Barack Obama.
Yeah, and then everything's cool now.
We
and
shall
no
overcome.
problems.
Right.
Yeah.
That's pretty much what happened.
Yeah, but I mean, in Japan, I think a lot of people in Japan, at least your average high school, college student, whatever it might be, I think a lot of them don't really know anything about Imperial Japan period.
Wow. That's unfortunate.
Or it's very, very sanitized.
Yeah.
It's presented at all. So that's it's also weird though that I guess because of that sanitization, there's also this weird thing I saw, and I don't know what it's called, but there's a thing in Japanese culture where they have pictures of old aircraft carriers from World War II.
Oh.
Then they'll have like a picture of an anime girl in a bikini next to it, and it's like an association, I guess, of a character who's like the personification of an aircraft carrier.
Well, all right.
And
I don't get.
Also, I don't know if you've ever seen a Japanese aircraft carrier, but those are pretty much like the ugliest ships that ever existed. So I don't understand how these ships are supposed to be attractive, but I'm guessing if they actually taught the history of Imperial Japan, this probably wouldn't be a thing, is what I was driving at.
Yeah.
That's circle the wagons. That's
They changed the narrative. It's what they did in Japan.
Yes. Well, we used to have these aircraft carriers, and it was fun, and we. This one would be like this girl in the yellow bikini who enjoys sushi. It's like, no, it's a little different than that. It's a little different.
Oh, yeah, way to control the narrative. Do you think capitalism is exploited?
Inherently, yeah, I think it is. You have to exploit labor to get profit margins, and that's where a lot of people derive their profit. I mean, that was Pullman's thing.
It is.
Suppress wages to
get your proceeds.
make sure you get the profits out of it.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's what Bezos was doing at Amazon. even to a more egregious extent, to some extent, because I mean, at least with railroads, they have a high overhead.
Yes.
But Amazon was making record amounts of profit every quarter, and then he went on Twitter one time and asked, "Well, what do I do with all this money?" And his
Feed
workers
the
all
poor.
said, "Why don't you pay us more?"
Yeah.
He said, "I'm not doing that. That's stupid. Maybe I'll start a space company."
Oh wow.
Yeah,
House the unhoused. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
And,
Yeah.
I mean, he still would have had a wildly profitable company, even if he just increased pay, and it would still be irrelevant to him and also his shareholders, but
Right.
he wouldn't do it.
Go downtown any USA, put those people under the viaduct into some places to live. That's what you do with that money. That's insane.
Yeah.
Do you think the United States could ever get away from capitalism?
I think it's possible to evolve away from it in some way. I don't know exactly, but I mean, because obviously capitalism didn't exist at one point. We had mercantilism, and before that we had more feudal arrangements. So eventually it will go away just because of evolution of social institutions.
Yeah.
But I think we're sort of in a bit of a process of that to an extent. I mean, I think too, once especially because of AI and machinery, we're going to reach a point where the value of human labor just really isn't very high.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because when you go into these stores, supermarket, and the like, you see self-checkout, and I don't think some of those workers realize, like, this is your job. When I'm in a particular store, not picking on anyone because most of them have it, and I will prefer to go to a checkout person to have a polite conversation to brighten their day, and they will point me to self-checkout, and I'm thinking, like, this is your job. Like, someone is quantitatively assessing how many people go through this line versus this line, and then as a result saying we can eliminate you.
Yep.
And I don't think people realize that. So when you are pointing people to that self-checkout, you are basically pointing people away from your wages.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess too, at this point, there are a lot of jobs that exist by convention more so than by necessity.
Yes.
And I mean, I think it's going to affect every field, but I think the people who are really going to take the hit first are going to be in the service industry.
Yeah.
So I mean, we'll eventually have to have something kind of like what Andrew Yang was talking about, the UBI.
Yes,
because,
that's right. It will have to happen.
There are certain, I think eventually, like I said, it'll affect everybody, but at first it's going to be those jobs where they're easily done by fairly cheap computers.
Yes.
That, and even, I mean, they built automated McDonald's before. They've had that technology for decades.
Someone told I haven't been to McDonald's in forever, but someone told me that they haven't.
Well, this was an experiment they did, I think, in the late '90s, early 2000s.
Someone told me that they had that set up inside of the lobby of McDonald's. I haven't experienced it. I don't know if that's a fact.
Well, I know I haven't been in a McDonald's in a while either, but I know a lot of fast food places now, they have a self checkout thing,
must be what they're talking about.
and then the workers are just there in case the drink dispenser runs out or whatever, or to make the food, but they don't
Add
really
more syrup to the water.
They don't interact with people anymore, really.
Wow.
Which I guess, given the effect on some people's social skills that the pandemic had, maybe that part is not a tragedy, but I don't know.
Yeah, things have changed.
It's a weird experience though, to put your back facing the employees and then enter an order on a computer screen, and then you turn to them to get it.
Yeah.
It's a very odd experience.
Generationally, again, people who are older than TikTok, or I could take it back, people older than Facebook. How about that? Again, it's definitely uncomfortable for us. But this new generation, they don't want to talk anyway. They just want to be on their phones anyway. So they're like, oh, I don't have to talk to you.
Although, I mean, the thing is, because there's still a pretty good amount of people who are anti-technology, older generation, a lot of them are not happy with these changes.
Yeah. I like talk. Like I said, I enjoy being able to talk to someone. But I think because we monetize everything,
Yeah.
So I think, we still have waiters in our restaurant. So until they can figure out a way. Well, actually, no, because we still have waiters, yes. But some places have that little box set up where you just order at the table. So, wow, yeah. Yeah.
Or the, I guess a lot of sushi places, they have those, and I think also a lot of the cantina style places, they have those little things where you check off what you want and then hand your piece of paper to the waiter.
Yeah, yeah. That does happen. Yeah, everything is monetized, and that does kind of bother me a little bit, because when we have 500,000 homeless people, in the United States, what do we have? 3/5 of people own everything.
Yeah.
That's greed, and that's a shame.
Yeah, I mean, we have the greatest inequality seen since the Gilded Age.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, we're kind of due for a Debs figure.
What if Bernie would have won?
Oh, that would be interesting. Because if you think about it, like, even if he had passed 20% of what he ran on, I mean, think about how much more that would be than, Trump or Biden. So if he had been elected in either 16 or 20.
Where do you think and I don't think he necessarily went wrong, but where do you think he went wrong with votes? Like, he didn't attract the people that he should have been able to attract. I like Bernie, by the way.
I think in many ways he was a victim of low name recognition early.
Okay.
I think, too, he maybe overperformed a little bit in 2016 because a lot of those voters were just anti-Hillary.
Uh-huh, yeah.
And it made people angry that she was kind of inaugurated rather than just having to go through the process of the primary.
Sure.
But I think a lot of it was, again, that the yes word, socialism. So he had to work to destigmatize that a little bit. I think he succeeded a little bit in that. But a lot of people just, because they saw that label, they didn't trust him. And ironically, given what we're about to see later this year, people were worried he was too old. And so...
Yeah, which is crazy because I think people always talk about Biden's age, and I'm thinking Trump and Biden, they could have went to high school together, depending on where their birthdays landed, and someone got held back.
I think Trump would have been a freshman when Biden was a senior.
Yeah, so I just don't get how people are picking on Biden's age.
I mean, sometimes it's odd, that narratives like that will take off, even though if you think about it, they don't make sense. And
right.
Trump's had plenty of senior moments, especially since 2020. Things he's said in speeches are just rambles and wanders off the edge of a cliff.
I think he did that at 20, though, 25, 30. I'm not sure if that's a senior moment or just
that's
a Trump
the thing
moment.
Too, he's never been particularly bright.
Right. You remember him from back in the day,
Yeah, I remember seeing
New
clips.
York. And
he was definitely better in interviews back then, but he wasn't dramatically better.
I remember that entire Central Park, the Exonerated Five, I remember that entire situation like it was yesterday. That's when I was first introduced to him. And even when he was rambling about that on television, I was thinking, you don't make sense because you're not judge, jury, and executioner to say that these young men at the time are guilty. Yeah, I was thinking, who crowned you king, sir? And then I did, some research on
his
him.
dad's trust account.
Of course. That's all it takes. That's right.
But yeah, he, my first introduction to him, I guess when I was a kid, Home Alone 2, he had the cameo.
Oh!
And,
yes!
So that was actually, people would point out to me, oh, that's Donald Trump. I'd be like, who the hell's Donald Trump?
Yeah, he was on The Simpsons, too.
Yes, I didn't really know who he was until, the time of The Apprentice.
Really?
And so I only saw the ads for it. I never really watched the show. But then I watched this Comedy Central roast. So it was actually my first huge introduction to Trump was the Comedy Central roast.
Interesting.
And then that was also when he became a birther, right around that same period.
Yes.
So at first I thought Trump's career was never going to take off because I heard he was trying to run for president as a Republican potentially. But then I saw with the birther things that he was on TV talking about how he has these PIs in Hawaii investigating blah blah blah, and then that same day or the same week was when Obama announced that Bin Laden had been taken out. And then
checkmate.
So that was the same night, but earlier that night he was at the Correspondents' Dinner, the one where they do comedy.
I remember that.
And so he made fun of Trump. He's like, man, I wish I had such important concerns to worry about. And so he's talking about the differences between his decision making and Trump trying to decide whether Meatloaf can run a hot dog stand or whatever. So he made fun of him. And then later that night he's like, yeah, I ordered Bin Laden killed, and I went to do a comedy thing. Then I oversaw it, and it's done, and got Bin Laden. So so it was the perfect way to make Trump look like a complete goofball and of no consequence. So I figured that has to be a burial.
Yeah.
That's put a tombstone on it. That's It's over.
And all the while, pride is brewing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Pride is.
I'll admit I was definitely wrong on that prediction.
Yeah.
Because after I saw that day, I'm like, there's no way in hell his man is coming back from that.
Do you think Bernie Sanders, if he would have, well, he's not running ever again, but do you think if he would have received the nomination and won the presidency, do you think that would have transitioned the United States more toward a better understanding of what socialism is? Because we do have a corporate class struggle in this nation, and I don't think people really understand it. And I strongly encourage people to do their own research.
It would definitely have caused a major conversation about what it means, and also the implications of socialism. And I think he would have, if he had the nomination and then he'd gotten coverage on a major scale, because now the news media couldn't ignore him completely.
Yes.
Then he'd be able to explain it. That being said, I think one of his weaknesses, especially in 2016, was that he was not all that great at explaining exactly what it meant. So he wasn't as solid when it came to explaining the differences between, say, a democratic socialist and a New Deal Democrat. Which, based on most of what he ran for, he could have just called himself a New Dealer.
Yeah, 100%.
But I think partly it's because of the time when he grew up, he was still democratic socialist and there were actual New Dealers around.
Right.
And he was not on the same page as them for a number of reasons. But I think if he had just called himself a New Dealer, he could have avoided a fair amount of problems.
Okay. He could have attracted more people.
Yeah, it wouldn't have been as precise necessarily, but still, it would have. I think, especially with the older voters who mostly voted against him, it would have been more acceptable, more relatable.
Yeah, public conscience definitely could have changed with that. That's an interesting perspective. I also, I have these conversations quite a bit with my students, and some people still have the idea, and it's an opinion. It's 100% not a fact, because I have to tell people that poor people below the poverty line, they go to work every day, but so many people out in the world are misinformed. They think that people are underprivileged and poor because of their own doing, right? Yeah. And that's what I appreciated and presently appreciate about Bernie Sanders, that he understands the system is the problem, right? The system is the problem.
Yeah, it's also interesting that starting in 2016, because I know before that, there was usually an effort by candidates to disguise their regional accents or downplay them.
Yes.
And then, you got Bernie like, let's talk about the millionaires, let's talk about these problems. And you got Trump doing his accent, and so it's kind of interesting because the regional accents made a roaring comeback out of nowhere.
Yes.
In terms of stylistically, I just thought about that,
but people are comfortable with what they know, and they're comfortable with capitalism. They don't know how capitalism was started. Clearly the roots slavery, we know that. But I don't know if people are willing to change their relationship with capitalism.
Well, I guess it depends on what their relationship is as an individual too. I mean, I feel like a lot of the people who end up gravitating toward that end up either coming from a background like Debs, where they see the contrast between their upbringing and other people, or it's somebody who works at a place like Amazon.
Yes.
And they didn't anticipate any of this, and then now all of a sudden, they ask for something reasonable like air conditioning, and they can't get it. And then they have to really think critically about their relationship with their boss.
Absolutely. Change happens from the bottom up, so I'm always in support of workers, collective bargaining, unionizing, because that is how change happens. Throughout history, it's always been the bottom up. I mean, the civil rights movement, you have to put pressure on the folk at the top in order for things to change. So I do hope that Americans can come to the realization that exploitation is real and capitalism is real, but the exploitative measures of capitalism are they're real. But reading Eugene Debs' work, he talks a lot about how chattel slavery was the basis of exploitation in his work. Yeah, he does. And of course, there's what do we have? Capitalism and slavery. How capitalism destroyed America, Black America. There's a million books on it now. Eric Williams' book. But yeah, Eugene Debs. Yeah, he talks specifically about chattel slavery. Yeah, and he does. He explains it well. And clearly, there's not a lot. I don't think there's any recordings of him, but I can only imagine how he was able to articulate that to the crowd. How people were jolted and emboldened by his words.
Yeah. I also wonder, especially with the older orators who have a pretty rich vocabulary.
Yes.
I wonder how many actual words the crowd knew or understood, or whether they were just mostly following along with the cadence and the gist. Because
interesting.
I noticed that sometimes even lecturing the college students, sometimes if I'll pause to ask if they know about something like what oligarchy means or whatever it might be, I usually get a lot of blank stares. And so I have to suspect that it was often the case that crowds were mostly responding to either the general tenor of what was being said or just the speaker's personal kind of aura.
Yeah. It is. You make the preacher type of delivery.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's kind of actually that goes in the category of one of Eugene Debs' quotes, where he says, people you really don't, and I'm paraphrasing, you really don't need a leader, because over time and after a while, someone else will come who's just as charismatic and leads you in a different direction.
Yeah.
So he strongly encouraged people to, apply what's happening to you, do your research, read for yourself, and realize how what's occurring in your life is uncomfortable. That's how change happens when you wake up.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so he was pretty big on that kind of, I guess, what we today call to do your own research school of thought.
Yes.
So that was very much his ethos, I think. And
indeed.
it's also worth mentioning in brief, his brother was also a labor leader, Theodore Debs.
Ooh.
Not quite as accomplished, but still pretty important, actually.
Runs in the family.
Yeah, so they worked together. They were on the same side of it, which I guess is, helped to make Thanksgivings less awkward, because if they had been on the opposite sides of that, like if his brother had become a Pinkerton or something.
Oh no!
That would have been awkward.
Oh no! And but we see shadows of Eugene Debs with Bernie Sanders.
Oh yeah, and I think Bernie has consciously modeled himself after Eugene Debs, so he's mentioned him as a major influence before.
That's good. Yeah, Bernie he actually did some sit-ins at the University of Chicago to integrate that campus. Bernie's a man, and it's unfortunate that the United States as a whole, because he did fairly well, but it's unfortunate that the United States couldn't really grasp his ideologies, because I thought they hit home.
Yeah.
But a lot of backlash occurred, and I do think we can be divisive,
Yeah.
When things are getting too close, when the United States is feeling too united, when things are too comfortable, there's one thing that divides a nation like no one else. Race.
Yeah. I mean, that's
the dog whistle.
Definitely helped Trump.
That's the dog whistle. It's always been the dog whistle. And as a historian, both of us, that's we can draw a linear line. That's the dog whistle. And that's unfortunate. I wanna get to a point in America where that's no longer the dog whistle. Well, as some people say, now it's a bullhorn. Dog whistle politics. I think
it's not very subtle.
Yeah, I think that died with Reagan.
Even with Newt Gingrich, it wasn't that subtle.
Yeah.
Because he'd say, urban populations have these issues.
Yes.
But whereas, with Trump, he'll just be like, yeah, we got a lot of Mexicans here, and so it's not very subtle in any way.
Yeah, but I think we can get to a point if we want to, because we are in control. No one should have the ability to use that as a device. But I think we can get to a point to where we have a politician who comes along and tries to use that, and everybody looks at him like this is old, right? We don't want it. So until that happens, until America can unite and reject that, we might be in trouble, but it's coming. Realize when that is being played. Realize when that bullhorn, dog whistle, realize when it's being utilized as a tactic, and say, try something else, because this is not working.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. You have to reject that type of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Who was the guy, who Lee Atwater, wasn't
Oh
that
yeah,
the
the
guy?
Republican strategist.
Yeah, who said you can't go around dropping N-bomb anymore,
Yeah.
right? Like you used to do with George Wallace and the like. And people say he's the guy. You have to shift it and start using these abstract terms, right? Urban.
Yeah.
So
now, it's also funny. I've heard about Atwater. The reason why he even became a Republican is he just looked at the two parties and said, "Well, right now there's a real dearth of talent over there, and if I join them, I could be the man because most of these guys are dumb as shit. So I could be the man, So that's what he did. He just went over there and he's like, I can teach them how to talk like adults, and then I can become famous.
Unbelievable.
So he's apparently somebody who had no real convictions one way or the other. He just.
What was he, from South Carolina?
I think so, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because he had he had a very he had the end of his life was very traumatic. Did you? Yeah, he had some ailments, brain surgery. Yeah. You guys can look that up independently, but he had a very tragic ending. But oddly, prior to that decline, he was often on stage playing guitar with like black bluesmen. Like he was always oddly, well, not oddly, that's hypocrisy. That's America in a nutshell. So that's about right.
I think partly is I don't think he was personally racist. I think he just wanted to get rich off of racism. So
Entrepreneur.
Yeah, I mean I don't think. I think that's the thing with a lot of the politicians who are actually the best at dog whistling is that they're probably not really that racist on their personal level. Mm-hmm. It's just
it's a way to win.
Yeah, it's what they do to make their money and to get their voters riled up.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's all just a big act in most ways.
Mm. And unfortunately, the only person that knows it's an act is them, because everyone else is getting played. Right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah.
People who believe it are getting played.
Yeah, that's for sure. Just like that, I love the idea of Trump's advertising as the blue-collar billionaire. That's got to be the weirdest label I've ever heard. It's just the most counterintuitive, insane attempt, and somehow he sold it.
And people buy it.
Yeah, some people bought that one. Because I figured if any label would be so oxymoronic that you'd just laugh at it, it has to be that.
I'm still amazed how that even is a thing. He's nowhere in the category of blue collar.
No, I doubt he's ever done a seconds labor in his whole life in terms of anything manual or in the realm of blue collar. I can't imagine that he would have. So
marketing.
I mean, yeah, and I don't know. I can't think of anything that he would have done that would be blue collar ever.
That's his base. I mean, have you seen the breakdown? I mean, I think people have the right to vote how they want to vote, do what you want to do. I mean, that's constitutional law 101, right? Freedom of speech, do what you want to do, all that good stuff. But just a breakdown of people who voted for him. Not saying being a college graduate is the end all be all, because I don't necessarily believe that puts you above anyone else. But if you look at the breakdown, non-college graduates are more attracted to him. He gets that vote.
Yeah.
He gets the Appalachian vote. And I'm amazed.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, between Well, I think there were trends already happening where, for a long time, people with just a 4-year degree trended pretty solidly Republican. And then, so that was usually considered a Republican demographic, and then that started to change a little bit in 2008. But again, that's partly the Bush collapse, so that's,
Indeed.
You could make a case that that's just what that is. But then you get to 2016, and all of a sudden, for the first time, you have just regular high school graduates going Republican. And then you have your 4-year degrees now going Democrats. That was a big change after, I think, 40 years of it being pretty set.
Yeah.
So.
And I've dissected it, I mean, I clearly I come through the historical lens, and I've seen that happen over time. But now I wonder, it's not even I wonder, it has nothing to do with Trump's ability or inability. It's what he represents.
Yeah.
For some people.
Yeah.
It's what he represents.
Although the
power for some.
Yeah, the ability is definitely also not really present. So, I mean, that's why I always love those conversations where people talk about all the things he accomplished as president, and I always have to wonder, can you name anything?
Yeah.
And usually the answer is no.
Yeah. People. Well, we'll see. We have, he'll get the nomination. Clearly, Nikki Haley is still in it. Yeah. So we'll see how that goes. And I think she could do a better job at being honest.
Yeah.
The mere fact she's from South Carolina, I think, being honest about your history could benefit. It could benefit her, and I think she's so. I don't know who's her Republican strategist, but
with median voters, yes, like in a general election sense, it probably would help. But with the Republican base, though,
yes.
I don't know.
I could see how that could be a turnoff.
Yeah.
If she's too honest, but she has to think about all those. What wasn't it South Carolina who tilted the votes for Biden? Like the black women in South Carolina pretty much took
when there was that big consolidation.
There you go.
When like Buttigieg and Klobuchar and all the rest dropped out and endorsed Biden last minute, and Clyburn showed up. And,
and it's like I don't know who her Republican strategist is. I don't know who her campaign manager is, but I do think that entire her state, she has the power. And she doesn't realize it simply by numbers, and study how Biden won. And I don't think she wants to alienate. It's basically what you just said with the Republican base. I don't think she wants to alienate. But that's the only way I see her being able to win is taking a different approach. You can't beat Trump 2.0. That job is taken.
Yeah,
right? And Ramaswamy is trying to be right. That's what he's trying to be. That job is taken. DeSantis tried to beat Trump 2.0. Look where it got him.
Yeah, he's more like Trump negative 2.0.
So, in my opinion, like I said, I'm not her campaign manager, but in my opinion, I think she needs to take a different route.
Yeah.
And in South Carolina, the best way to do that, of all states, is to be honest about your history. Try to shift some things. You know, the mere fact that she goes by Nikki says that's not even her real name, right?
Honestly, I think she should just stick in the race and see if maybe Trump goes to jail. I think that's her strategy. I don't think she's really trying that hard because she's really just trying to be the last person who's a candidate in case Trump becomes ineligible. I don't think she's really playing the win, and also just given the loyalty the base of the Republican Party has to Trump, I don't think she could. Even unless it started out with just a one-on-one and she was able to really target in on Trump's weaknesses. Yeah. It would still be an uphill battle though, and I think the person with the best chance would have been DeSantis, but he turned out to be a weirdo.
Yeah, he was. People didn't like him.
The high heels and everything else, and I don't know. DeSantis is also just not a personable, relatable person. He just seems very plastic and turned out to be a terrible campaigner.
I thought it was pathetic. Because I didn't appreciate what he was trying to do, like trying to be a carbon copy of what we've seen already. Like, just be authentic, be yourself, you know.
I don't know. With him, I'm not sure if that advice works. I mean, he's out there.
Got it.
And DeSantis
He's too far gone?
Yeah, DeSantis is a weird dude. I think he might be like that one candidate in, what was that show, Parks and Rec, where there's about the candidate being the perfect candidate because he literally goes in his office and just stares at a wall and shuts down and goes back into candidate mode when he walks outside.
That makes him the perfect candidate?
Yeah, I mean, so he's kind of like that, except he sucks at being a candidate. Is sort of my impression of DeSantis.
Yeah.
Because the more people are exposed to him, the more they're thinking, man, that guy is weird.
And the brain drain out of Florida is bad news. And I tell you that I had several, not several, but 3 colleagues who left. 2 are in Indiana, and the other one is here. Well, it's like...
Not surprised.
Yeah.
I saw a bunch of job ads from Florida recently.
Yeah.
So it makes sense why they're available.
You couldn't pay me enough money to be a history professor there.
Well, see, it's also funny because if you read the verbiage now of the Florida university ads, it uses the phrase, we practice customer service, to talk about how they approach students.
You could not pay anyone enough money to be a political science professor there, nothing in that category would be comfortable for anyone right now. I'm not saying that's not going to change, because it's going to have to change in order to attract people back to the state, because if you don't, your economy is going to fall eventually. Or decline. I won't say fall, that's extreme, but decline.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like at this point, because of polarization in our politics, if you want a sense of what the Republicans don't like out of their own side, just look for silence around their response. So if they really don't like something, what they'll do is just not say anything about it. And you notice with DeSantis, most of his initiatives are super culture war, but in a way that's targeted to the most engaged online weirdos who are just obsessed with really tiny, off-the-wall things. And then you'll notice, if you look in a comment section of something, even if you go on like a right-wing site, Rumble or whatever, where it caters to a more right-wing audience, you'll just notice crickets.
Yeah. There's
no response. There's no condemnation, but there's also just no anything. It's just people trying to pretend it's not real. Not happening. So that's how you know that DeSantis is bad at picking issues, because he can't get a reaction on a lot of the things he goes for.
Do you know the new strategy online? It's interesting that you mentioned comments. The new strategy online is people going on particular sites or commenting on videos or whatever and saying, well, they may not be black, but saying, oh, well, I'm a black man and I think DeSantis is the greatest thing ever.
As a whatever identity, I believe. Yeah,
that's the new thing now.
Right.
We've already known that, because you're telling on yourself. No one black would say I'm a black person and no, it's just you voice your opinion, right? Yeah. So people, that's the new strategy now. I'm a black woman and Trump he's the greatest thing ever.
I mean,
I'm not racist, so I'm going to attack this black woman and say I'm a black woman.
But I see that comment style. I think it's just become a little bit of a rhetorical meme.
Yes.
So I see it on sports videos and entertainment videos where people just kind of post as a whatever fan.
Yeah.
Or as a fan from this age bracket, or as a something-year-old. That's just how every comment begins now. Yes. It's just you have to identify yourself based on a demographic piece of information.
And that's when people know that you're lying.
Yeah, because a lot of people get accused of lying for doing it, but a lot of people, I think because it's become so common, a lot of people do it in good faith too, and then they don't realize that it comes across as dishonest.
Right.
And somebody accuses them of lying, and they get in a flame war.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, it's just become this standardized way to.
I think it's comedic. I laugh hysterically every time I see that. When people criticize the vice president, Kamala Harris, it's always, I'm a black woman, so this isn't racist, so she's the worst, and then they list all this stuff. I'm like, okay, clearly you're not a black woman, all right, because there is no need to declare yourself. Because what you say is valid if you feel that way, regardless if you're black, white, man, woman, whatever. You don't have to identify and be classified as a non-racist if you feel that way. So the mere fact that you have to say that you are a certain phenotype tells me that you're a racist, right?
Well,
that you're telling me you're a racist without saying you're a racist, because you're saying the mere fact that you have the same phenotype as that person, that your ideas are valid.
yeah. But speaking of people, using someone else's identity to try to fob off their comments,
Right.
you know what that reminds me of? Do you remember the show Boondocks?
I do. How could I
Do
forget?
you remember how Uncle Ruckus always identified as white?
Yes.
And then he'd tell people with their face, like, as a white man. So I feel like this would be much more funny if, you could actually see the faces of the people leaving these comments.
Yes.
So that way,
Yes.
to do some verification.
Like that episode on the Dave Chappelle when Clinton Bigsby, he's at the Klans meeting and he takes off his hood.
Yeah.
And all the Klansmen are just looking around at each other.
Yeah.
If they can expose themselves like that.
Yeah, or they had to talk to his friend. It's like, so he doesn't know he's black, does he? No, he has no idea. I don't know how to tell him.
Yeah. Yeah. Expose those. Yeah, and a lot of them have been exposed online, as white guys.
Yeah.
Saying like, in fact, who was that? Oh my gosh, they're on a message board. It was recently, and I can't remember what I was either reading or watching or whatever, but a couple of white guys were exposed for saying that I'm a black man and Trump has done nothing but put me in a position to blah 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 back in blah blah blah. And then some on the message board, the host has the ability to unmask something administratively, like click on something, because I believe the person had like a different image up and the host clicked on it and they were quizzing. They said, but you said you're a black man. And he was it was funny because it was all live. I'm pretty sure someone can look this up. It was all live. He was busted on the message board. And instead of just hanging up saying, oh, I've been caught, he just kept going back and forth with him. Like, dude, just hang up, say you've been caught, and click off.
Yeah. I don't know. It's funny. It's just, I guess with the anonymity of the internet, a lot of people try to really, if they think they're going to be more persuasive if they speak to your demo. What they don't realize, though, about those online message boards is that they're self-selecting.
Yes.
So most of the time, if you do something like that, you're just preaching to the choir, and
Yes.
it's completely pointless.
Yes. Yes.
So there's really nothing to be gained from doing it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And yet, people do it.
And that goes exactly because people think if someone is of the same phenotype, it makes their opinion more valid or more acceptable.
Right.
Like, this person said it and they're black too. Like, no.
Yeah.
No, that's not
Yeah.
how it works.
Yeah.
You dumbass.
Well, yeah, it's just one of those things where it's just the idea of, we have some superficial characteristics the same, therefore we must think alike and be alike.
Right. No one's a monolith.
And also, if you've met more than 10 people in your life, you know that there's some people who maybe don't have their shit together,
Yeah.
who can match your outward characteristics,
Yeah.
and who you don't want to listen to.
Right.
So it's not really a very persuasive argument.
Yeah.
As a form of establishing trustworthiness.
Yeah. Trust me. We trust what I say. We share the same phenotype.
I think one way to combat that would be to make ridiculous claims that are clearly untrue about one's identity.
Yes.
As a veteran of the Civil War, I'd just like to say that just start it out like that, and just make a ridiculous claim that makes a mockery of the meme until it goes away.
Yeah.
That's sort of my approach to it.
It's hilarious. Yeah.
But
I served in Iraq, so that
yeah.
certifies me to
On
say.
both sides.
On both sides.
Yeah. So.
Oh.
The food in Saddam's camp was shit, so that's why I left, but so I think it's just that's the way to deal with that.
Yeah.
Is to expose it for the mockery that it is.
Yeah, it is. It is. You have to laugh at it because it is mockery. It is mockery. So every time I read it, I get a kick out of it.
Yeah.
And at this is modern times. These days and ages, You just gotta laugh at stuff like that because it's where did you go to school that you think this is
Well, I mean, I think a lot of it is, and I think it's with some relatively intelligent people who just get into little tropes or memes that they copy without really realizing what they're doing. I mean, I remember there was somebody I went to grad school with, and she became a massive Hillary Clinton fan in 2016, and Hillary talked about being like a champion of children or whatever. So I noticed on her social media, now all of a sudden there were pictures of her with kids, and it's just like sometimes I just see this kind of mimicry of trends where I don't know how people get sucked in or relate to these trends in that way or try to put themselves into it. I don't know exactly what drives that impulse, but I do see that a lot. Or I notice I can tell what my mom's been looking at on Facebook based on what she talks about. I can figure that out pretty quickly.
Indoctrination. Is it that easy? Yikes. That's scary.
So I mean, if my mom reads about something or one of her friends has an issue, then she'll somehow figure out how it relates to her.
Interesting.
And it's just, I don't know, I feel like it's a social media thing and a more broad phenomenon where people just kind of latch on to things that probably don't apply to them and just make them fit.
That is scary that people can be conditioned by something so superficial as social media.
Yeah, especially people
scary.
Who were adults when it came out.
Right.
But then again, maybe the younger generation's more inoculated to it. I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just I do find it. Or another example I can think of is sometimes I watch more political oriented videos or channels, and if you see somebody who's a fairly popular representative of some viewpoint, then you'll see their flock of imitators who also make mimic videos.
Oh yes.
And then you see in the comments you have people making their own little versions of that in the comment section.
Oh yes.
So that's a little bit different, but it's still kind of the same phenomenon of people just playing copycat, but thinking that they're really making this their own by using the same arguments and the same words and the same approach.
Copy and paste.
Yeah, and again, it's just it's something that I guess I've never been somebody to really follow trends too much. I just kind of do what I do.
You're your own man.
And I just it baffles. I wonder what's happening in people's heads when they. Because I assume it has to be inadvertent. I assume it's not a conscious thing they're doing by just latching on to some of this stuff.
It is. It's scary. It's scary that someone can be led astray so easily.
Yeah.
Yeah. And nothing to bounce those ideas off of. That's what's even scarier because you're just taking in that perspective and running with it.
Yeah.
But that is the world we live in. So.
Because I can understand it more with kids because a lot of learning is imitation at first.
Yes.
When I see adults doing this kind of stuff, it starts to become a little bit more disturbing.
Agree.
And.
But that goes back to that one person you said that labor is associated with a skin color, so that's probably that's and that person you said
to be fair, I mean maybe he was being creatively inept, but I guess I assume he's basing that on back in the primary the idea of running as Bernie that they tried to promote as well. Bernie is only class issues, obviously. We've put him in this hole. He does this issue and that's it. And he's weak on race. We said he's weak on race because he's weak on race. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
And Hillary will be the strong one on race, despite the '90s existing. So that's what we're going with. This is the dichotomy, and
yeah.
So yeah, that's. I don't know. That was the whole thing that made me furious too. Is just the idea that the woman who said super predator is better on race than the guy who opposed the crime bill, but
people don't do their research. People don't, and I mean, your classes don't get in depth, I guess, to the level of my classes because of the topic. But like I said, these topics happen quite often in my courses, and people just don't. They like their echo chambers, and just like I disagree with those echo chambers and having a solo perspective, I have to respect that this is the United States and they have the right to do that. But it is infuriating.
Yeah.
It is, and I just hope that they catch up.
Well,
And I'm not necessarily saying catch up to where that's
Yeah.
don't take that. No, I mean just get a different perspective. Like bounce those ideas off of someone else. Contrast those ideas. Does it make sense? Make it make sense. Like it's okay to hear different perspectives.
yeah.
That's what I mean by that. Like, but again, although my approach is to have a variety of perspective on an issue and come to a concise, my determination on how I feel, etc. But so many people, they're in their echo chambers. They have the right to do that in this country, so I guess we have to accept it.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I guess eventually the echo chambers, as they fight each other and shift members subtly around,
Yeah.
I guess that's how change happens. Just echo chambers battling it out as they. I don't know. I was trying to
Yeah.
come up with a good metaphor for that. But I can't think of anything.
Yeah.
Um,
Understood. Understood.
so I guess that's pretty much everything I have to say about Debs and
And everything else?
and everything else.
Absolutely. It's always a pleasure to have discourse with bright people, with you, bounce off ideas and conversation. You guys can check me out at Bookworm to Bookworm, of course.
Yeah. Well, thank you for doing this with me, and I guess we can call it a day here then.
We can. Dr. Shepard out.
All right. Well, Thersites out. So, see you guys around. I'll probably have some more Roman videos up this coming week, but you know how that goes. We'll see what happens.